right. Welcome everyone to today's workshop, Consulting on National Park Service Projects with NCPH and OAH. I'm NCPH Director Stephanie Rao, and I'm really excited to see all of you. I'll provide a quick overview of our plan for the workshop today and introduce our panel of speakers. But before we begin, please note that Zoom's auto captions are enabled for the workshop. Just click the CC button if you would like to view those captions. And I also want to remind you that we are recording this workshop today so that you can catch up on content afterwards, and so that people who weren't able to make it are able to catch up on this content as well. If you have a question that you want to ask, that you prefer to ask without it being recorded, feel free to send me a direct message in the chat and I'll ask that question on your behalf. We really hope for this workshop to be interactive, so please don't hesitate to ask questions along the way. You can either use the chat box or you can use the raise hand feature, and we'll get those questions and discussion going. Also, feel free to be on camera or off as you need to. Our only request is that if you're not asking or answering a question or participating in conversation, to please stay muted. We have a short agenda document and some links to some outside resources. I'll put that in the chat momentarily. If you want to be able to take live notes in that document during the workshop, that's totally okay. Feel free to request access to edit it. Now I'm pleased to introduce my co-presenters and to get to the content of the workshop. So we are joined today by Anne McCleary from Anne McCleary Consulting. Anne chairs NCPH's Advisory Committee on NPS Collaborations and also has been a PI on many projects with the Park Service over the years. We're also joined by Anne Wisnant from Duke University and Primary Source History Services. Anne is another member and former co-chair of NCPH's NPS Advisory Committee. Lots of acronyms today. If anyone has questions about any of them, feel free to put those in the chat because we get used to them and I know they're not regular for everyone else. I also want to introduce Angie Cerna from the National Park Service, knower of all NPS acronyms, I'm sure. And last but not least, Paul Zwarecki from OAH. Paul is the main contact for all of OAH's work with the Park Service and is a huge wealth of knowledge. So thank you all for joining us today. And now I'll turn it over to Paul, who can start our discussion on who are we? What do we do? How do we manage these projects? So, Paul.
Thanks, Stephanie. Good morning, everybody. Stephanie said, my name is Paul Zwarecki. I'm with the Organization of American Historians. Current title is Director of Advancement and Strategic Partnerships. But as Stephanie said, when I joined the OAH 5 years ago, I came here specifically to manage our relationship with the National Park Service and specifically all of the work that we undertake in partnership with the Park Service. So I guess the big question is sort of who we are, why we're here talking about this. I mean, I could talk about the OAH and I'll probably defer to Stephanie to talk about NCPH specifically, but since about 1994, the OAH has had a series of what are called cooperative agreements with the National Park Service. This is a sort of legal mechanism through which outside organizations can do work with the Park Service. And obviously, as the OAH, we tend to focus pretty specifically on projects within the realm of history and history program in the Park Service. So what, our role as a partner organization is that we will work with our contacts in the Park Service to sometimes develop projects, other times to just kind of learn about a project that is in the works within the Park Service. And then, if it seems like a good fit for the OAH to potentially work with the Park Service, we'll undertake what's called a task agreement. And that task agreement gives us the ability to, basically figure out how to conduct that project for the Park Service. Our process, the role that the OAH takes is that we will work with our colleagues on the project in the Park Service to identify a principal investigator, or PI, we'll probably start using that acronym, to actually kind of lead the project, to do the research and the writing. And most typically the projects that OAH takes on are essentially what are monograph length book projects, original research projects. And there are some specific ones that, specific sort of genres of project that I think Angie will talk about when she's up. But we'll work to go to our sort of bullpen of members to identify someone who's got the relevant subject matter expertise and other types of experience that we factor in, and hopefully hire them to essentially write this research report for us. At that point, as far as the OAH's involvement, we trust our experts to go and do the research and the writing. I, at that point, basically take on something like a grant administrator role where I'm, taking care of the logistics of the agreement, making sure that the reporting is done when it needs to be done, quality control on some of the deliverables, and just really fulfilling sort of an administrative role, making sure that the work of our PI is happening in the way that it's supposed to happen, on time, on budget, and that everyone is ultimately happy at the end of the day with the work that is being done. We can obviously get kind of more into specifics about what the role of the cooperator in the space OAH or NCPH is, but maybe I'll defer to Stephanie here if there's anything you want to add about NCPH and how you do things.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. We use a really similar process. We do similar types of projects that OAH does, but we have been taking on some kind of new and different and experimental projects for the Park Service because public historians like to find new models and new ways. So we have done some programming work with the Park Service. We did a symposium for the 50th anniversary of the Lincoln Home National Historic Site, where instead of kind of one overall PI, we had some, content advisors that helped us think about the big questions and presenters who should be a part of that. We also try to tie our Park Service project work to other things that NCPH does. So we have a working group structure that we use at our annual conference that is geared towards getting a group of people together to have in-depth conversations and to come out with some kind of product. And so we've used that workshop format to help bring NPS sites that are spread across the country together with scholars who, are sort of leading changes in historical research in that particular area. So there's a real broad variety of the kind of work that we do. And we'll talk a little bit actually next about what the more typical kinds of projects are that both OAH and NCPH do. And there are links in that resource sheet to both organizations' sites that kind of talk a little bit more in those specifics. But I do want to give Angie a chance to talk for a couple of minutes to folks about kind of some of those typical projects that both organizations do and kind of what they are and what they mean.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. I'm Angie Cerna. Let me just introduce myself real quick. So I wear two different hats right now. My usual job is that I am the lead historian for the Park History program for the Intermountain region. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But currently I am doing a short stint, it's called a detail, with the Washington Support Office with the Park History program. So I'm kind of wearing both hats today. So I'll be kind of speaking from both lenses. And also, before I came back to the National Park Service, I did these projects as an independent person as well. So I have the experience of doing these projects, but also the experience of managing these projects. That's what I do now, is really project management. Usually with these projects, I'm called something, it's called a ATR, Agreements Technical Representative. Again, another acronym for you. Sometimes I'm also called a subject matter expert, but basically I'm the counterpart to a Stephanie or a Paul on the Park Service side of things, just making sure, like, writing the scopes of work for these projects, working with the parks to get that information, finding a cooperator to do the projects, and then just helping make sure that we're staying on the timetable that we established at the beginning, and making sure that the projects are completed. So that's my role in all of this. We, in the Intermountain region, There's only 2 historians for the entire region, working in the regional office for directly with parks. At the park level, we only have 2 park historians. So we definitely rely a lot on our partners to help us do this work, because all these parks, I have 86 parks in the Intermountain region, and they all need help with their baseline documentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what these baseline documents are. So we have something called historic resource studies. These are kind of part historic context studies and part survey work. So looking for properties that could be eligible for the National Register. We have park administrative histories. So histories about park units or even programs or regional offices. Just understanding how they became what they are today, essentially, is the question with those documents. We also do National Register nominations, and we do some special history studies as well. For example, we have a special fund source for civil rights projects right now, looking at African American civil rights. So we have a number of projects that we call special history studies that deal with that kind of area of history. So both of these types of baseline documents are usually multi-year projects or bigger projects. So it's really nice to be able to work with NCPH and OAH to utilize their membership. They have great membership that have a wide diversity of skills and knowledge that we can tap into. So that's why I like working with both of them. I also, as a lead historian for a region, I also have a lot of smaller projects too, that I try, if you're looking to just get a foot in the door working with the Park Service and want to take on some smaller projects, maybe not these big baseline documents, I'm always looking for people to do determinations of eligibility for the National Register. We'll have some smaller projects. I can pay people up to $10,000 using a credit card, which not a lot of people know about. We also have other kind of agreements and mechanisms that we can get to folks. For example, we have an agreement with the National Experienced Workers organization, which is a nonprofit, where if you are over the age of 55, we can bring you in that way through that organization. So beyond the NCPH and OAH kind of bigger baseline documents, there's a lot of smaller projects and smaller work that also needs to get done too.
That's a great point, Angie. And there are also ways, even within the larger projects, that we often look for peer reviewers and for copy editors or other kinds of work that are smaller subcontracts, but still get you kind of really good experience understanding how these projects work. And it's also fun just to be curious about what's the new scholarship and what is the Park Service up to. So that's rewarding as well. Again, feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat. I am trying to keep a list in our notes document of these common acronyms as they come up, but if I miss one, feel free to put it in the chat. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add before we head to our next section?
Well, one thing, and then maybe I'll just mention one other thing from our agenda, but just your point about like peer reviewers and copy editors, that is a great point, because when I was talking, I talked about having the PI and someone who's going to undertake one of these multi-year commitments. You're absolutely right. A great way to get your foot in the door is, we do peer review just about every single NPS project that we work on, and that's a great way to just see what one of these looks like, and we provide honoraria for those, so it's paid peer reviews. I guess the one other thing, I don't know if we want to mention this now, but how to learn about these projects. Do we want to talk about that real quick? From the OAH perspective, the best way to learn about them is to be a member of the OAH, because then you'll get all our emails and communications, and every time that we have an available, just about every time we have an available project, we will communicate that out through an RFP, and that goes out to our listserv of everyone who's a member. You don't need to be a member necessarily to respond to an RFP. We do encourage being a member in good standing should you be selected for one. But if you're not a member, you can also follow the OAH on our social media, LinkedIn, everywhere you can find us, that we also publicize the availability of work there. Both RFPs for big projects to be a PI, but also once in a while the need for, like a peer reviewer or someone like that.
And I will just say ditto to everything Paul just said for NCPH. We follow the same process for kind of membership requirements and how we promote the RFPs or RLOIs, which are the acronyms we will be digging into next and that I will add to our list. So I'm going to turn it over first to Angie to talk about what is NPS looking for.
Thanks, Stephanie. And I'll just note for everyone, like when we're looking at letters, when we're looking at proposals from folks, there will usually be a Park Service person like myself involved in the selection. And what I'm looking for when I'm looking at proposals or reaching out to a researcher, I'm looking to see if this person or team, if they've had prior NPS experience. And if so, how did their project go? I think that's probably one of the more important things that I'm concerned with, is just because Park Service is its own unique organization and animal, and we have all these acronyms, and so it helps if someone has like some understanding, coming into the project. And and I'm looking for people with good track records, people who have a good track record of completing projects. That's one of the biggest challenges with these baseline documents, is that they can kind of go on forever, and we want to make sure that they are finished and they're not just a draft, that they are like fully and completely done. So to see folks who have that experience, that is always really great to see. And if you don't have NPS experience, that's okay too. What I'll be looking for is, do you have you completed projects of similar scope and complexity? Just to make sure that the types of projects are comparable. I get asked a lot if you need a PhD to do these projects, and I would say no, you don't need a PhD to do these projects, but I need to see, so if you have a master's degree, I need to see that you have done something of a similar size and scope, right? And a lot of these projects are monographs, so I think PhDs have an easier time showing that they are able to complete a monograph, because if they did a dissertation, it's kind of the same level of effort in many ways. But beyond just kind of previous experience, I'm also looking at the approach to the project and the budget. And so just looking at the kinds of questions that the person is trying to address, and then just see if the budget and timeline look reasonable to me. I would say, so usually our budgets are fixed. And usually with NCPH and OAH, they do know what the budgets are in advance. I'm trying to think of a recent example where we didn't share the budget, and I can't think of one. So you should know the budget with these projects going forward, so you know what you're working with. So we're not looking at like the cheapest option or the most expensive option. We're looking at how well the money is being used, right? And if, just to make sure, like if there's a significant travel component for a project, to make sure like travel is included in the budget, like things like that. And then in terms of timeline is where I actually have the most flexibility. But what I'm looking for is mainly that the timeline seems reasonable. I would rather see a timeline that is longer than shorter, because if it's longer, then I feel like you have a better understanding of the complexity and scope of the project, versus something that is too short. And I think that there's no way that something could get done in that amount of time. So so those are the things that I'm looking for when I'm reviewing these things. I know Anne and Anne will be discussing more about how to read an RFP. So Anne, wasn't it? I think you are up next.
Yes, Anne with an E is up next. So hi, everybody. I've done several of these types of projects through mostly through the OAH, I will say, but also through a university before. And so I have a sense of how to look at these requests for proposals, also known as requests for letters of interest. They're a little different, and sometimes also referred to as scopes of work. The thing will come to you that says essentially what the NPS is trying to do. And so here are the things that I typically look at when I'm evaluating a scope of work and trying to see if I can understand what's going on and whether I would be interested in it, or whether someone else would be interested in it. And I will say, I have also had experience with looking at these documents as a member of the NPS NCPH committee that is coordinating this cooperative agreement with NCPH. And one thing that we do as a committee is try to preview scopes of work before they go out to all of you in the public who might be interested, to see if there are kind of landmines there, things that are not clearly explained, and so forth. So what I'm going to say here is based on both of those experiences. So when I look at an RFP or a scope of work, first I will look essentially at what is the overall concept here? What type of project is it? What category does it fit in of those categories that Angie mentioned above? So are there some sort of standard expectations of what this type of document is in the NPS world of expectations? And does it seem in general sort of a realistic statement of a goals of a historical project that you could imagine doing? A second thing that I would look for always is how detailed the scope is about what previous research is relevant to this has already been completed, particularly that is already that has already been done by the NPS. Often when you have these larger studies and projects, such as Angie was mentioning, of historic resource studies, administrative histories in particular, or even National Register projects, the park has already sponsored lots of other things that will help you with that. Have they compiled a good bibliography of that? Is there a list of it? Is it clear what those things are and where you would find them? I look for that work, that legwork, to be done hopefully by NPS before it comes to me, so I have a sense of what's out there that I can work with. A related thing that I always look for is there clarity in the scope of work about the primary sources? That if the person is expected to do primary source research, which could vary depending on the type of project and how NPS defines the level of effort in the project, we could probably talk about that later. But if they're expecting original primary source research, has the park or NPS done the legwork to tell you what sources they know about that are available? How much of those sources are there? Is there 40 linear feet, one box, one file drawer? Where is it located? Are they in 3 different archives in 3 different locations? Is it organized? Is there a finding aid? Or are you going to be faced with, the file room that no one has looked at in a number of years, and you've got to go through these things? So you need to have some clarity, and the scope should give you some clarity about what primary sources are out there that they expect you to use and where they are and how much of them there is, because this will inform your creation of the budget or your estimation of your time. In particular, I also look in terms of primary sources about whether the scope or the project expects interviews to be done. Many of these projects do expect oral history interviews. How many? Who are the people? Do they expect you to go to those people? Can you be doing it by Zoom? Do they expect transcripts to be done? This will also shape how much time it's going to take you. Relatedly, the question of travel. Online sources possible? Are you going to need to go to archives, sit in archives for weeks on end? Where are those? Are they in expensive places? How much time will be involved? And what travel is involved in going to these places to get the sources? Next, what deliverables? What is NPS expecting you to hand them? Is it a monograph? Is that what they are describing, a book-length project of some sort? Is there a sense of how many words if they say a monograph? Is there a separate piece, sometimes referred to as a transfer of knowledge deliverable, that you're creating that is going to take some time? What is that? Are they expecting you to make a story map, do a presentation, something in addition to kind of the main product? And then the final couple of questions that I would ask myself looking at a request or an RFP or a scope is separate pieces of work that need to be done to get the thing over the transom. Who's doing those? And how much might that cost? Photograph permissions, any layout and design, copy editing, and what is called 508 compliance, assuring that the final PDF is accessible to people with various abilities. And also, will there be peer review and by whom? And then finally, you would look at the timetable. But as Angie was saying, that's sometimes a more flexible piece. But you want to see if you actually think in the scope, usually there will be a timetable, kind of preliminary timetable laid out. Know that that's not always, you don't always have to just accept that. You should take a look and see if you could actually make that work. So those are the things that I look at in any scope that comes to me or any request or RFP. And I think we're now going to Anne without an E, McCleary, who's going to talk about how do you know if it's a good fit?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. So it's, these projects are really exciting. And I think we all think, oh, so much fun to work for the National Park Service and do this project. But it's like taking on any kind of job. And so what I'm saying is not going to be any great surprise, really. What do you want to gain? You always have to think about that. What do you hope to gain from these projects? Along with what do you bring? Because I think it's been brought up before that you need to also be bringing something to the table. And sometimes we have seen applicants who apply for jobs and we have no idea why they apply for these. Anne and I are both on the review panel along with Stephanie and Megan, and we're wondering, what is it why do they want to do? It's not always reflected. And also I think it's important to think that, that do you bring a body of academic expertise? That's come up already. Have you had experience researching this topic? It's not absolutely required. And my experience has been some people with a little less experience have sometimes gotten the job because they've sold themselves well. But do you have that experience? And then also, do you have background in working on the research of the National Park Service and its history? There's a lot to know. And I think the first project I did, I was a little surprised at all I didn't know. But now I understand it a lot better and I know where to go look. But just anticipate that the first time you do a Park Service project, it's going to take you longer to get up to speed in terms of what resources are there, what are the areas that you're covering. So just anticipate that. Also, is the timeline realistic for your schedule? These timelines are developed and I know as we've seen these develop at NPS, and I think probably for OAH, we develop these for a generic person to do. Maybe you look at that timeline and you'll say, I don't know if I want to do the project, but the timeline isn't right. And I think as Anna said, you can negotiate that a little bit. I think it's worse if you don't, in some ways, reflect an understanding of that timeline. Another area that I've seen is travel. A lot of these records, Park Service records you might want to use are not digitized. So you're going to have to go to the Park Service. In some cases, I know I've worked primarily in the Southeast. They've had archival projects going on where they've pulled together a lot of these sources. So they're organized into finding aids, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the records you might need are in people's offices and you don't know, or you can't find them and the park hasn't kept them or who knows where they are. So just understand the travel is going to cost money. And I have to say that you need to think, and I've seen this in some of the ones I've reviewed, someone's on one coast and applying for a project on the other coast. And I'm wondering, do they really have enough time? And do they have enough in their budget to make the trips? Because I guess one of my last comments is it always takes longer than you think. You think it, and then what you've estimated, it takes longer than the proposal. I've been involved in a lot of these, and I will say it always takes more time and it always takes more work on your behalf. So definitely keep that in mind. You've got to be prepared for being flexible. That's definitely something you need to think about. And I will reiterate too, budgets are not usually negotiable. Sometimes we've seen applications come in and they're higher than the budget amount and they try to justify that higher amount. But, if you look at the budget and you say, wow, I can't do that because I'm looking at travel or I'm looking at whatever I'm looking at, then I think it's really important that you just pass it by. It's okay to pass it by. There are lots of projects out there, and find something else. So don't feel like you have to latch onto every project. It's probably better to wait to find a project that really fits with who you are and what your interests are. All right, so I think it goes back to, oh, does it look good? Who is it going to now? Is it me?
Now we're going to move to talking about preparing budgets and responding to an RFP LOI. And I think,
Is it me about tailoring it to the scope of work? Well,
Yep.
that's me. So I've talked a little bit about that. Things that I've seen, and again, I think I've been on this committee, Ann and I've both been on it, I don't know how many years, 3, 4 years, I don't know, but we've seen a lot of applications come through. And these are areas that I'm particularly, I pay attention to, and I know Ann will chime in a little bit more on the budget. Focus on the project. We have seen applications sometimes from companies, CRM firms or whatever, they have like, you know, most of the page is about the company and the little paragraph at the end is about the project. I would say if you want to be more successful, then I think you want to say more about the project. There's nothing worse than saying, oh, this is all my company has done, or this is all I've done, or this is all my university has done. And it's a little paragraph at the bottom. I'm interested in this project or something. That just doesn't, it makes it feel like, oh, just yet another application. It's like applying for jobs. And so, you know, if you just reiterate everything in a job ad and then you have a little bit at the end about why you want it, that doesn't usually sell the person who's looking to hire you. So think about that. Definitely highlight any experiences and interests you have related to this proposed project, anything. So even if you haven't written a park administrative history, but you've worked as an interpreter or you've done something in the Park Service, describe what you've done, anything you've done. If you've had, you know, because people do venture into new areas. So if you, anything that's related to what the project is looking for, tell us about it. If you don't tell us, we can't be expected to know as we're reviewing. So that's something to consider. Think about your methodology for completing the project. We do look at that, the methodology, the project outcomes, we read it. And we think about, is that, some of them have been pretty impressive. Some have been less so. If you have sources referencing secondary sources that you're aware of, either in both in the park service and also in the field of history, you know, definitely give us your methodology. We want to know more than a statement like, I can do this. Okay, I can do this. That's fine. And I know what I'm doing. And Ann will be talking a little bit more about this as well too, the project schedule and the budget. Do not simply take the schedule and budget on the RFP and say, our LOI, and say, I'm going to follow this, because to me, that looks like it looks like I'm just churning these out. Like I've not put that much attention into this particular proposal. It's like, this is what they want, I'm going to do it, because you need to look at it. So I know we've seen applications before where people in academia, and they perhaps change the timing a little bit to give them more time in the summer for something. So if that's the way you have to do it, tell us. We want to see that, rather than you sort of just taking what's there and trying to say, this will work for me. And the same, oh, well, Ann's going to talk about the budget in a minute. And just be sure to mention any experience you have with the National Park Service. You don't have to have written an administrative history to apply for one. You don't have to have done a historic resource study to apply for one, but show us that you would bring that kind of experience, whatever that may be that you have, to the project. We really want, and I think this will be addressed. We've really talked about trying to diversify the pool of people who apply and the pool of people who get the awards. Obviously, we at NCPH don't make the final decision. The Park Service does, but we really want to bring new people into this process. We want more of us doing this kind of work. So we're not going to eliminate you just because you haven't done something, but tell us what you bring that's relevant to the project. And then the hardest part is the budget. And I'm going to turn this over to Ann now.
oh no, I think Ann with an E has frozen.
Oh dear.
So while we wait for Ann with an E to get back into Zoom land, are there questions that people have now that you want to be able to ask, or things that are unclear? All right,
She's coming back, I think.
she's back. Perfect.
Okay,
Yay!
so I don't know if that was me or the session that went down, but just a moment, let me get back to what I was. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the budget, which is a real area that that's been frustrating to me, I'll say, as a person doing these projects, because really, as was mentioned before, the projects are going to already come with a bucket of money. Before it reaches your desk as a potential consultant, it has already been through a process inside the Park Service where decisions have been made about how much money, how much this project needs. So that's frustrating because you are not involved in that conversation really. And what you really are doing as someone producing a budget is creating a time budget for yourself. This money is available. How much time do I think I can devote to it? How do I think this money is sufficient for the time that it's going to take me to do this project? And two other key things to bear in mind as you're developing any kind of proposal about the money is the question of whether you are working alone or working with others. And this will shape how you can make use of the money. If you're doing all the work yourself, or are you able to hire people to do pieces of it that can then save you money in terms of perhaps travel? Maybe you can hire some people who are closer to the archive to do something that will take less of an hourly rate than what you pay yourself as the PI. Can you hire graduate students? I'm not advocating exploiting students, but can you hire junior scholars of some sort to do pieces of this that you can perhaps pay different amounts of money to different people involved? And then the other big thing that affects the budget is, what is your employment situation that you are bringing to the work? Are you working as a sole proprietor, that is a person in business for yourself, by yourself? Are you an employee of some kind of consulting firm that does these projects? Otherwise, are you an employee of a university? These look really different. And the reality, the realisticness of doing the project is different depending on them. Having looked through many dozen proposals that have come across since I've been involved with the NCPH agreement, I really noticed several things about the budgeting, and in a moment I will want to share a screen to show you a comparison. But in generally, I notice what people do when creating these proposals. The PIs will typically make like 2 or 3 large buckets of their expected expenditures: personnel, travel, and sort of other. And most people just put kind of a flat amount of money in the personnel and don't really indicate all that clearly what that is buying, what that person is doing, or how much time it will take. The travel budgets that we've seen overall can range from very general, I'm just putting $5,000 on travel, or they can be dividing it out more in a granular way, X number of trips, Y number of days, hotel, airfare, etc. And then there, like I said, usually there's a lump sum that's put in for things like production or image permissions and preparing of the 508 compliance or so forth. It is very rare in the budgets that I've seen that a proposal will cross-link activities by any of the main project historians with any representation of the time that this is going to take. And as I will show you in a minute, the time is that people expect to put in varies widely. And then I will mention that I've seen one proposal in the past that has developed their budget on a price per word based, X cents per word. The person projected 62,000 words for the project and came up with a rate of 28 cents a word and $17,000 for their time. I didn't think this actually worked really well, and I could say why later, but that's another possible way to approach it. I would like to screen share, if I can, at this point, to show you a comparison of 6 budget approaches for the same single project. So I'm calling this one project, 6 budgets. Just a minute and let me get this set up so that you all be able to see this. All right, so this was one project that was an administrative history project that came through the NCPH NPS cooperative agreement. It was a kind of unusual site in that it was multiple sites that are managed together as a single park, if you will, but it was an administrative history, sort of one of these standard documents that produces a book-length study. And that is what they said in the RFP, historical monograph, and there was also a public outreach component or product that was mentioned as well. The total allocation that was laid out on this project for the research team was about a little over $71,000. This built-in money for the 508 compliance at a specific rate of $2,800, and also added in a little bit for publication expenses. So it was somewhere around $69,000 that would have been outside of those two categories. But this was the pot that you were working with if you were responding to this RFP. Now we have 6 proposals that came in. Here's how their budget worked out. Proposal number 1 said a total of $62,000 for the personnel, the historians involved. And they had 2 people involved. One that was called the PI. That person was getting $53,000 and basically doing most of the work, the research, the writing, creating the deliverables, and doing the administrative work on the project, corresponding back and forth with the park and managing. There was a second person involved who was called the consultant, who was going to be paid $9,600, mostly for kind of feeding back and working with the main PI to kind of give them, I guess, someone to essentially to bounce ideas off of, to read written material and otherwise talk. This proposal set a bucket of $6,000 for the travel, 3 trips at $2,000 apiece. But no indication on this budget of how many days this would buy, where the hotels were, what were the flights costing, was there a per diem? You had no idea really how this $6,000 was arrived at, but that's what was put, and $0 for other. This proposal number 1 had no sense involved in the proposal of how many hours of the personnel's time it was buying for you. So the PIs proposed unlimited amounts of time, 3 years, the project budget, but you don't really know how much time they plan to spend on it. Proposal number 2 also threw $64,000, a very close amount, into the personnel line, and they divided it to 3 people involved: a PI, a project historian, and an oral history specialist. They proposed a same hourly rate for each of these professionals, but different amounts of hours devoted for each person. Again, they did not explain anything about what these hours would buy, but the PI was doing 210, the project historian was doing 165, and the oral history specialist was presumably doing oral histories with 70 hours. So all of those hours added up. In the final column, you'll see this group thought they were going to spend 445 hours on this project, all the historian personnel. They lived locally to the site, so put a nominal amount in for travel, and then threw in a larger amount for what they called a technical editor, and also making copies in 508. Number 3 threw $60,000 at the historian. This person was university affiliated, but didn't break out how that money was getting separated out once it arrived at presumably at the university where the person was working, but you didn't really know. No breakdown of tasks, no breakdown of hours. They put $0 on travel because they said they had other funds from their university to pay for travel. Now that's really important in terms of the person's experience doing the work. They had other money to draw on. And then they threw over $8,000 into these other expenses for kind of getting the report out the door. Proposal number 4, $67,000 thrown at the main historian personnel. They broke it out very differently. 2 people working, approximately similar numbers of hours by the 2 people working, and they, excuse me, proposed a much higher number of hours, and as you'll see, an hourly rate under $30 an hour, which is a whole other conversation about what historians should be being paid. But these hour estimates, I will tell you from experience doing these projects, are very realistic. And so Anne McCleary, and she mentioned earlier that you will be spending more time on this than you think you will. Yes, you will. Excuse me, this proposal estimated 2,300 hours for all of the 2 historians involved. That's realistic for a monograph length project. They're making under $30 an hour. They also broke out their travel somewhat specifically 5 trips, but you didn't know how long or exactly how much this was buying. No other expenses. Number 5, and excuse me, I'm so sorry. Number 5, 1 PI, 1 historian, simple breakdown, $68,000 at $100 an hour. Sort of a reasonable rate. So estimating 680 hours for the project. Interesting comparison with the others. Very small amount of travel. This person, I think, was local to the area, but no indication of how this $400 was come up with. And then finally, the last PI, the last proposal, was someone employed at a university. They put in money for their salary, essentially, at $49,000, 800 hours estimated, and they also included fringes as a part of that 49, which makes me think that proposal was someone that was bringing the money through to be paid through W-2 through their university. They also broke out a much larger sum and much more specific about travel. And as you see, that number went up to $11,000 because they broke it down about lodging and, air travel and per diems. And then they had also a more detailed breakdown in terms of other costs. The hour estimate for this person, 800 hours paid for. So you have a range from 0 indication of hours, from 445 at a minimum to 2,300. This is the core problem as I have experienced it with trying to estimate or wade into this kind of work, because the reality is that you can become quickly overwhelmed in terms of the time you're having to put in versus what you're getting compensated for it. Okay, so that's my slight soapbox on budgets, but hopefully helpful.
And I'll just add to that we love proposals that do break down those hours, because it helps us as an organization go back to the Park Service with future projects and be able to have information about how many hours the project actually takes, and to build a case for kind of a base rate and a base number of hours. Because our understanding in working with the great folks like Angie Cerna is that it's not that the Park Service is trying to underfund projects or have too ambitious scopes of work with not adequate funding, but that they're still trying to gather information to come up with what the best rates and scopes are. So that also helps us in that kind of advocacy work in those projects. Angie, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to add a couple things if that's okay. So first, I would say, so this project that Ian walked us through, not one of my projects, I will say it's a bit on the low side. So I don't want you all to think that this is like the common price for an admin history. I think it's really on the low end. But still, her breakdown is very good, and to walk you through the various things. If you find, if we get a bunch of proposals, and it's clear, like there's just not enough money for a project, then we would be talking about limiting the scope of work. So if we just find that on the Park Service side of things, like we were wildly off with our estimate and what we're asking for, then NCPH or OAH can come back and say, we really need to kind of pull back the scope of work a little bit to see what is feasible. A lot of this work for myself and with Stephanie and Paul is about managing expectations for everyone, both between the Park Service, the parks that we're working with, our clients, and then also with the folks who are applying for these projects as well. Like what can actually be accomplished during this time. And I will say, if you do get one of these projects and it's your first project, or you're doing similar type work, keep count of your hours so that you know for future proposals, like how much time things should be taking. When I was in graduate school and I was doing some park service type work just for my own research, my dissertation was a park service admin history. Yeah, I kept track of my hours just so I have a general idea of how things break down. But you all are historians, you know that it's very hard to estimate exactly how long a project will take because especially if you're doing primary source research, it can take you in a lot of different places. But it's good to have a general idea of how long things will take, as Ann and Ann were discussing. Like it can take you more than what you thought it would take, but we want you to be close. Like, if you're estimating something's going to take 400 hours, but it really takes 2,400 hours, well, that's a problem, right? And again, like the thing for me as a project manager is just making sure that our scopes and budgets, that the work can be accomplished. We want folks to have a finished product at the end. It doesn't help us to have like a 75% draft that's never finished. So that's always my main concern is like what is practical, what is feasible. And Ann and Ann, really the whole public history NPS committee for NCPH has been really helpful in giving us feedback on these scopes. So I just want to give them a shout out. It's very much appreciated. We need this feedback, right, as we're developing future scopes and budgets.
Thank you so much. I am going to propose a slight shift from our original plan based on the size of the group. So we have 37 minutes left in our workshop today, and we were going to split everyone into two groups to look at a couple of sample proposals. One that was submitted by individuals interested in a project, and one was submitted by a faculty member, because there are some kind of, as has been alluded to, some budget and scheduling implications that different groups might want to consider in different ways. But because we don't have a huge group of folks here live today, I think it might be most useful for us to stay together as a large group. And I'd like to propose that we take about 15 minutes to just kind of talk generally about where everyone in the audience is, about, do some of you have experience with these kinds of projects? What about this is interesting to you? And what about it is overwhelming? Just to kind of take a step back and allow you to ask them some questions and kind of think through this based on all the information that we've piled on you over the last hour. And then we'll spend the next 15 minutes digging into these two sample proposals that we've shared in the Google Doc. And then we can kind of come back and wrap it up. So again, feel free to use the raise hand feature to ask your question live. You can type questions in the chat. And as we're kind of waiting, maybe Ann, if you have some reflections, or Angie from your inside the NPS days, some kind of reflections on the first projects that you did. But again, we want this to be kind of conversational and pretty informal. And again, if you want to ask a question or share something that you don't want your name attached to, since we are recording, feel free to private chat it to me through Zoom.
I can start by saying my first project was relatively small. It was an administrative history, but it took way more time than I thought it would, just to get familiar with the landscape of National Park Service history. There's the tremendous amount of research out there. And I'm not sure that I knew all that. I thought I knew a lot about the National Park Service, but there was a lot I didn't know. Since that point, I've been able to get to what I needed more quickly to figure out what resources would be most beneficial for what I'm doing. So I would say just getting familiar with the landscape of doing National Park Service history. I find it really interesting, but it's a little bit of a learning curve, I think, for the first time you do a project. So just anticipate that, not that it's bad. It just may take you a little longer to figure out what's where, and you can always reach out to us. Some of us maybe in our committee, we're happy to help with the experiences and the learning that we've taken from these projects.
And I'll add on to your comment that what I've learned doing these projects is that the more that you do, it doesn't necessarily take less time. Like you can't you can't really kind of increase your rates by cutting back on time. It's not gonna, it's still gonna take as much time as it takes, right? But I do think you get better as you do the projects. So just something to keep in mind if you're interested in pursuing these projects on and doing more than one.
I'll just add here, my first project was a administrative history also ran through the OAH that was interestingly was kind of a cleanup process or a second round process for one that hadn't been completed, you know, and so they had to come back and have other researchers try to complete something that had been started but sort of aborted previously. One thing I wanted to also add that kind of piggybacking on what Angie said about getting better at scopes of work from the side of things, that it has been my experience that a real advantage of working through the OAH and the NCPH is that these are supposed to be collaborative activities, but where there's, you know, a kind of a conversation going on among the parties involved about the project. And it has sometimes definitely been the case where I, as a researcher, have been able to look at the scope of work and come back to in my case, the OAH, and say, I'm interested in this, but the money is this much, and I don't think I can do this whole thing in this amount of money. Could we maybe take out this little chunk of what's in the scope of work and not do that? Like if the scope has in it, let's say something that could be hived off, like a little oral history project, then transcripts. Maybe we hive that off and they're willing to kind of take that out to make the project fit better with the resources that have actually been allocated for it. And so I don't know exactly how to advise people about that in terms of writing formal proposals for things, but I suppose it's something that you could include in your proposal if you were involved in a semi-competitive process such as this, to say, you know, I would recommend in my approach that maybe this component be removed or put later. And maybe there's a possibility to have that conversation if you become the researcher on the project.
Thanks. There are two questions in the chat that I wanted to draw attention to and that I think, Paul, you might have some insights on. The first one is from Jamie Ferguson, who asks, I worked for a county park system. Can entities smaller than NPS post scopes of work either through OAH or NCPH? And I responded from NCPH's end that we don't typically do that. If we did, because we're a small office, we would probably want to have multiple projects that we'd potentially be working on with a larger agreement kind of covering them. But what we do is we will post RFPs to our job page. So if you have a project that your entity is fully going to manage from start to finish and you just want help spreading it to the largest audience available, we will help you do that. But Paul, I didn't know if OAH had a different process for that. And then there's also a question in the chat from Charlene Myers about OAH NPS coordinated site visit reviews of national parks and if that is still ongoing. So I will shoot those both over to you, Paul.
Sure. Yeah, so in response to the first question, I think our answer is pretty similar to yours. We don't typically, we have not typically done that type of work for kind of smaller, state level or even local level projects. I was not to say we have a rule against it. It would certainly be something that, if someone wanted to reach out to me to talk about, we could certainly talk about it. As an organization, we are beginning to undertake additional types of public history work that is outside of the NPS world. So it's entirely possible, but yeah, we don't really have anywhere near sort of the formal process for that we do, after 30 years or so doing the Park Service. So But also like what you said, Stephanie, we also have a job board and we're happy to publicize, publicize calls. And that's just, a matter of reaching out to me as the point of contact and sort of talking about that directly. The second question about OAH NPS coordinated site visits, for Charlene's question, it sounds like you're talking about what might be like a scholars roundtable type project. And we still do those projects. Most recently, we did one 2 summers ago, I think now, out on the West Coast in San Francisco. Project that was looking at, we brought a group of scholars together who had expertise in, in freedom seeking, essentially, freedom seeking in the West, where free people went after they escaped slavery. So we have done those before. We still do them. But like any of these projects, it tends to be project based, right? That was something that the Park Service and a group within the Park Service called the Network to Freedom came to us to help them bring together a group of people who could speak about that. So it does happen, but and we do often put out calls for people to participate in those roundtables as the subject matter experts. But it's totally dependent on whether the Park Service is looking to work on one of those with us.
Thanks, Paul. We have a question for you, Angie, in the chat that you mentioned smaller projects available with budgets around 10K. Are those posted through the same RFP RLOI process?
No, those are more word of mouth projects because they're usually really small and we need to deploy someone quickly. So it's just kind of based on word of mouth. You are welcome to send me an email with your resume and the types of things that you're interested in. I'll drop my email in the chat. But yeah, we don't have like a really great formal process for that. It's just kind of as things come up and we need to deploy someone quickly and if we can find the funds.
Can I also say, I put this in the comments, but I don't know if people understand how you fund the program to OAH and NCPH. So you might want to talk about the indirect costs that help support your time, just so people understand the difference between that and these individual projects that Angie could bring to you. So you have to be part of a network. So I don't know if one of you would speak to that, just so they understand the basis of it.
I can start with that. And then I also want to plug that. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. I can't type and talk anymore. I used to be able to do that. But NCPH maintains a directory of consulting historians. And this is also a place where the Park Service might come to look for potential folks to work on these smaller budget projects. The link is right here. The only requirement is that you're a member of NCPH, and then it allows you to share kind of your fields of expertise and the kinds of projects and geographic areas that you're looking for. So that could be another way, if this kind of work is of interest to you, kind of writ large, that you can, get your name kind of out there and more visible. And Paul, feel free to add if OAH has another process for that. But Anne, thank you for bringing us back to the larger conversation about how these projects differ from kind of direct consultation work. So what happens with these projects is that you get to work both with either Paul or myself or Megan Hellman from the NCPH office as partners on these projects. So for NCPH, if someone like Angie has a project that they need to have done in their park or their unit or their region, they'll come to Paul or to me or to any of a number of hosts of other organizations and universities that have these arrangements with the Park Service. And they'll say, we have this project, this budget, are you interested in it? We will take that, in NCPH's case, we take that to our advisory committee to look at the scope of work, to look at the budget, to try to make their best determination of, is this work achievable in this amount of time for this amount of money? And we look at a budget that is probably larger than what is in the RFP or the RLOI. And that larger budget includes direct project management time for NCPH or for OAH, coordinating and scheduling meetings, setting up contracts, handling the process of paying everyone. And then we also got a modest indirect fee for the work that we do. And then we work with the Park Service to put out the request for historians or PIs or, project, whatever the terminology that we're going to use is. Our advisory committee reviews those, makes recommendations based on the strength of the proposal, based on, what we know about these scholars, but also thinking about wanting to spread this work among the widest variety of public historians to make sure that we're not sending all of this paid project work to really large firms, or not sending all of it to faculty who are able perhaps to subsidize their work time. So they really think in this kind of broad picture to try to spread projects out among the greatest kind of diversity of public historians. And then we work with you along the way. So you as a PI would contract with NCPH or with OAH. We would keep you on track with your timeline. We would help facilitate communication with the Park Service, and we are also the ones who pay you. And so it is really a collaborative experience. And speaking for myself, and I know for Megan, as we talk about this really often, we love helping facilitate these kinds of projects, because so much of the rest of my work is spreadsheets and cat herding and budgets. And it's really, really, really rewarding and fun to see the new scholarship that's happening, to see the impacts that we're having on public understandings of history, and really to be able to contribute in meaningful ways. So Paul, I will let you kind of share anything you have to add from the OAH perspective on that.
I mean, this will sound like a broken record, but very similar in terms of how the OAH does it as well, to what Stephanie described. Yeah, I mean, there'll be an overall project budget that is bigger than what we are typically offering PIs to do their work. That's because we do the exact same things that Stephanie indicated that NCPH does. Like I said earlier, sort of fulfill the role of basically a grant administrator. We take the responsibility of making sure that all the required federal reporting is done. We typically, I'm not sure if this is the case with NCPH, but we will typically also manage the publication side of the work in terms of the copy editing and the formatting and 508 compliance. So we typically keep that kind of in-house at OAH as opposed to that going to the PI, which is, I mean, there's, if it's different from how you do it, I'm sure it's strictly just a preference thing. But yeah, I mean, we do things very similarly. And also echo what Stephanie said. I really do enjoy doing this kind of work because it's, when I get to start like reading these drafts and eventually seeing the finished products, it's when I get to be a historian again, because the other 95% of my time, the PhD in American history doesn't always seem totally relevant. But this time it absolutely does. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'll say we do usually take the same approach about the kind of copy editing, compliance, publication work. Sometimes we leave it open, and sometimes you'll see in our requests for letters of interest that there's a budget number and then there's an optional additional number. So for example, if it is a firm that has a copy editor in-house and they want to handle that, you have that choice. But we try to be as transparent as possible in the request for letters of interest. But that's definitely a place where if you're reading it and you're like, this doesn't make sense to me, shoot us an email and we're happy to make it make sense for you. But our goal is always to try to get teams of historians as much of the money for the project as
absolutely, yeah. That's always my biggest goal. I mean, my biggest goal is making sure the project is done successfully. That's 1A. 1B is making sure that, historians' work is valued properly, and that if you're going to take on one of these projects, you're getting paid at a level that makes sense for the expertise and the value of your work.
Absolutely. I also see Anne's question in the chat for Paul, Angie, and myself about whether a researcher is able to develop a subsequent publication based on their work. And my understanding is that yes, they can, and they are encouraged. You're encouraged to. There will be language about sort of the nuts and bolts of how that works in your subcontract. But my understanding is that this work is being done for the public, and the Park Service wants it to be as broadly distributed in as many ways as possible, and that our goal is for this work not just to be useful for the Park Service, but for the contractors who are doing it as well, that it should serve you professionally. But Paul and Angie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that we are always really thrilled when that happens, when one of these has been, adapted for, potentially an academic or even a popular press. Generally, and maybe Angie will correct me, but I think the only requirements are to, inform the Park Service that it's happening, inform the OAH in our case that it's happening, and then we usually ask for sort of written acknowledgement somewhere in the acknowledgements of the final or the new version of it that just says that the project, originated with funding from the National Park Service and the Organization of American Historians.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Please, we do love to see derivatives of this work to be published as an article, as book chapters, as monographs themselves, like however we can get the information out to different audiences is always great. Just to note that like the report itself, the Park Service owns the copyright to it, but that does not mean that you cannot take pieces of it or whole parts of it to publish elsewhere. I think you just have to talk to the publisher about what their comfort level is. And I will say, we briefly mentioned transfer of knowledge component earlier today, and oftentimes the extra like academic publishing or other kind of publishing is unpaid work. Folks who are doing it are usually academics where that helps their tenure profile or whatever else, but we also work with a lot of independent consultants who that is not a great, doesn't really help them that much other than just, a line on their CV that could help with future work that they get. But in one project I was involved with, I was actually a co-author on, we had some money left over in the project, and we had this transfer of knowledge component as part of the scope of work. So we ended up co-authoring a piece for the public historian as a report from the field, and that'll be out in September, I think. So that way, that was like a win-win situation where the consultant I was working with, she got paid to do that work. And we could get a publication out of it. We could, put it in the public historian to drum up more interest about the study itself. So that could be a potential model for future projects. As with transfer of knowledge components, they're really, usually kind of vague, or it's usually like a presentation to staff, like not very creative, I should say. But that could be something to think about with future projects. If you know at the beginning, like, yes, this would be a great like book chapter, this would be a great article that I would love to submit somewhere, to make sure you get some of that project money to help support that like kind of one-off deliverable, I should say. The other thing is just keep in mind, yes, please let the Park Service know about it. If you're working with a park, it's just good professional courtesy to let them know, like, hey, this is going to come out, and maybe even let them review if that's okay. Although they don't need to, it's just again, professional courtesy. But I will say, if there's any kind of sensitive information, particularly around archaeological resources, like their location, we can't publish that. But that'll be outlined in the scope of work of like what information should not be public.
Thank you, Angie. I think as we're in our last 15 minutes, I think we'll shift now to looking at the two sample proposals in the Google Doc that we shared. That one is, they're both for historic resource studies, one for PECOS and one for Lowell, that were put in by different types of audiences that I think will give us a good chance to talk about the different ways that and the different structures under which people can get involved in this work, whether you're doing it as an individual, as part of a consulting or cultural resource management firm, or as a faculty member, either officially through your university or not. So I thought maybe we could start with Angie, if you want to talk for a minute about the PECOS sample and the PIs selected from that proposal. And then Paul, if you want to talk for a couple minutes about the Lowell proposal, and then we can kind of open it up to those, I mean, really any questions, but especially if you have questions about what the different, what your personal positionality might mean for the type of proposal or how your agreement might be executed.
Yes, I had to pull up the PECOS one. So PECOS this is actually an administrative history for PECOS National Historical Park. We funded this project in two components. So the first component was the oral history portion of the project, and the second component was the actual writing, the research and writing of the administrative history. And we had several really great proposals for this project. I mean, that's been my experience with all my NCPH projects or in OAH projects. Is like we have really good proposals for these things, and it can be tough picking for sure. But what we liked, I'm just going to talk about what we liked about these proposals. So for PECOS, we liked that it was a team effort. That there were two people involved in the project because it was a pretty large project. PECOS had never had an administrative history written about it at all. So there was a lot of work to be done there. There was a really strong, big oral history component, as I was just saying. And what we liked about the PI background, one of the PIs, she was actually doing oral histories with a local community nearby. It's called Chamayo, if you're familiar with New Mexico at all. She was doing that as part of her dissertation work, and her dissertation work was looking at gosh, I forget what exactly it was, but like really just like it definitely had a lot of bearing on the PECOS story, even if it wasn't like exactly that, it wasn't on PECOS, it was a different site, but there are a lot of similar themes, I should say. And then the other PI for the project had experience working on another NPS project back in the Northeast. So I contacted my counterpart in the Northeast and say, hey, how do you like this work? And how are things going with this project? And they're like, it's going great. The superintendent loves this person, like very happy with the work that they have produced so far. So that was like a really great thing to hear. But what I liked about the approach was that they were really committed to using history to help inform policy. And that was really important to me, hearing that, because I think admin histories can be really useful for managers. And, the scope, the only thing, they were not local to PECOS. I think they're based in Indiana. So a bit of travel involved for them versus having someone who was local. But they included travel as part of their budget. We thought it was nicely broken out. And we thought that their timeline was pretty reasonable. What else do we want to say about PECOS?
Well, maybe we can let Paul do an overview of Lowell, and then folks, if you have questions as you're able to kind of look more in depth at these proposals and think about Angie and Paul's comments, please put any questions you have about maybe how they came up with things or how the committee responded to certain pieces of them.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to share this a successful proposal for the HRS for Lowell National Historical Park because one, I was in charge of trying to find one from faculty members, and our two authors here are both faculty. but also because this was, and I didn't include the actual original scope of work, but the scope of this historic resource study was a little different from other historic resource studies I've seen in that the park had really done a lot of work on it and had kind of a clear vision for what they wanted the resource study to look like. It's not to say that other ones don't, but sometimes, as Angie mentioned, these are baseline documents. So very often there is a sort of format and a set of boxes that need to be checked in one of these. This one was a little different in that the park had a kind of clear, I would say, historiographical approach that they wanted to take. They were really interested in finding people with a background in certain types of historiography and having them really address what they saw as being things that are of particular relevance to the history of the park. So what I really liked about this response was that the authors, I think, very clearly picked up on that and spent a lot of time talking about their methodology and the historiography, and even it was a co-authored report. There were actually 3 people working on it. The third person focused primarily on the digital transfer of knowledge component, but the 2 lead authors of the actual report talked about their own backgrounds and expertise in previous writing and how they actually were going to split up the writing of the report based on their particular backgrounds. The methodology and the logistics I thought were really strong in this one. We don't usually ask for this, but they actually gave a preliminary chapter outline. That's very typically the first written deliverable that happens on these monograph length projects, as an actual outline that gets reviewed. And that actually did happen eventually in this project as well. But I like that, and this goes back to what I think both Ann and Ann referenced at some point today is, they obviously very clearly paid attention to the scope of work and put a lot of thought into kind of specifically how they would address it. And lastly, the thing I liked about this is, if you're looking at it, it's the final page, but they gave us a preliminary project schedule. And it was not at all, well, not at all, but it wasn't exactly the one that we had given out as the sort of template for what the breakdown of deliverables might look like. This one was very clearly tailored to an academic schedule, which told me they were already thinking about, they know they're going to be very busy in the late spring with midterms and then finals. So there weren't a lot of deliverables or work expected to be done at that point. They did focus it on, kind of aligning to their academic calendar. The other very fun thing about this calendar, this original schedule, if you're looking at it, is that nearly all of the research trips and research was scheduled to happen in the spring and summer of 2020. So when Angie talked about, there's a little flexibility in scheduling, projects that started in 2019, we really pushed the limits of how much flexibility there was, because obviously the best laid plans there of taking research trips and just getting on a plane in the summer of 2020 became impossible very quickly. So it got done. It got a little stretched out, but yeah, I thought it was a very strong response from faculty members, because again, the thing that we are, and I know Angie has said this, that is really important, is we want these projects to get done, right? And there is a timeline, and when it comes to academic calendars, I want to make sure that that our academic candidates are really aligned with their other work, essentially. No, and to answer your question, there wasn't specifically a budget. They basically said that they would work within the budget that we had available to offer.
Thanks. So we have 6 minutes left. We've thrown a boatload of information at you. I have tried to put some notes in the Google Doc as we went along so that you have some information to refer back to. And I've tried to put most of the links that were shared in the chat in there as well. But as you're, maybe starting to transition to thinking about like, what actually would this look like for me? What questions or concerns come to mind? Because there are a lot of different ways to come into this work, and a lot of different ways, as folks have alluded to, that your proposals will look different depending on how you're situated in the field, whether consulting is your full-time source of income, whether you're doing it as a side hustle, or whether you're doing it, as a faculty member along with your other duties. Or anything, Anne, Paul, or Angie, that you
I hope the fact that nobody's asking questions doesn't mean that you're not afraid of trying. Because, you know, these are really rewarding projects. And so I know we may have made it seem a little bit like it's so intimidating to apply and it's so difficult. But I would say that having worked with both OAH and NCPH, people are kind. You know, you can talk to them, you can ask them questions, you can get to know them. And if they get to know you, they'll have a sense of where you are. They'll be able to help you more. But don't be afraid of doing it. I hope you all came because you were excited about these opportunities. And I hope we didn't leave you with this, oh my gosh, it's so difficult, I'm not even going to try it. Because that was not our attempt at all. Our attempt was to help say, it's doable, but this could perhaps make it a little bit easier knowing a little bit about it.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that, and that I am always looking for new folks to help with these projects. We have gotten, we've had bad habits in the past of like finding a couple people that we really like and do good work, and they've gotten a lot of projects and it's not sustainable, right? So that's my concern as a project man, as a program lead, is like, I want sustainability with our programs and our partners at that we're really spreading things around. So don't think that just because you haven't done a Park Service project that you won't be considered. That's not the case at all. It's nice when you have that experience. But you know, it's not necessary. And the other thing is, we just want you to be eyes wide open when you come into these projects. Again, it's about managing expectations for everyone, like what the Park Service expects, what NCPH, OAH expect, and then what you as the researcher or PI expect.
So we have a question in the chat from someone who's curious about the flexibility of the kind of side hustle aspect for folks who are in academia, and also curiosity about whether these jobs open doors to outside academia who don't get sabbatical, and how these jobs open doors to full-time jobs in NPS. I can say that we have not done a lot of projects where someone is the PI or the sole PI and has another full-time job outside of academia, because I think it is hard to be able to make the argument for getting time back. I know sometimes faculty, they either have a sabbatical or they do structure their projects so that they do a lot of work in the summer when maybe they're not being paid. But we do have, because public historians excel at collaboration, we do have a lot of projects that have multiple people involved. One that we just awarded and are working on is, you know, one person who is full-time, does full-time consulting work, but is a sole proprietor and can't do the project, doesn't have all the expertise to do the project solely on their own. So they're bringing in a research assistant who's someone who does have full-time work outside of this, and then another collaborator. So that is a good way, I think, maybe to kind of dip your toe into the work, is to find a partner or partners that can take on a first project as you kind of get a sense of the ebb and flow of the work and start to build a network. I don't know, Paul, if you have anything to add to that, and then Angie.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the like the side hustle question, that I mean, I think you're right. I think it would be a really difficult thing to take on one of these projects in addition to having a full-time job. But that's maybe where something like being a peer reviewer, you know, like that's much less of a time commitment. And if you've got the background and the expertise to offer a review, you know, I mean, those that's a way to get involved at a little bit less of a time commitment level.
And then Angie, did you have any thoughts to add about, I know the idea of work within the Park Service could be a whole session.
Yeah, again, my email is in the chat. So if you want to talk about careers in the Park Service or getting your foot in the door, I'm also happy to talk about those things. But I can definitely say yes. They can lead to positions in the Park Service. It worked for me. I wrote, after I graduated, I finished my PhD. I had a grant, one of these projects to write an administrative history for Stones River National Battlefield. And in doing that project, I got to know the folks in the Southeast Regional Office. And when they had a term position come open, I was encouraged to apply, and I got the job. And so the term position, had that for about 2.5 years. And then that led me to my permanent position, which I have now with Intermountain. And I know a couple other folks that you know, did, I mean, Terkaya Lowe, our principal historian, she did Park Service contracting work, I think during graduate school. So I know some other people that have done that as well. So yes, it can help, although there is a lot more to it. You have to get through USA Jobs, and you have to know about the National Register and all those types of things, which I'm happy to talk about if you send me an email.
I'll just quickly add on. I also had a recent PI who worked on a couple of projects, just recently got hired as a historian in the Senate. So it could potentially open doors to other historian positions in the federal government. I've literally one example of that I can point to, so it's true.
Wonderful. Well, that brings us to just after 1 o'clock. So I want to say a huge thank you to Anne, Paul, and Angie, and Megan for working all the magic behind the scenes. This was a great conversation. I hope you found it useful. The link to the Google Doc with these notes and resources is in the OAH platform, where you click to log into this session. So you can go back and refer to it any time, and we'll add the recording once it's processed and cleaned up. But I've put my contact information, Paul's and Angie's, in that Google Doc as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions now, later, about a request for proposals that you might see. Like we all said, we're here to broaden the the pools of people that we have to work with, and to make this work accessible for as many people as we can. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.